At the point when families accumulate for these special seasons, fun exercises are frequently intended to gain center experiences together. The Jones family chose to go buckling at Nutty Clay, yet they had no clue about the staggering misfortune their family would experience. This is the lethal breakdown of the Nutty Clay Cave misfortune. John Jones was prepared for some family fun when they chose to investigate the Nutty Clay Cave in the Utah desert, close to Salt Lake City. He had not been to this specific cavern previously, yet he and his sibling Josh had spent a lot of their youth collapsing an assortment of Utah caves. He believed himself to be an accomplished caver. However, his investigating had dialed back lately. He had gotten hitched, had a youngster, and was presently a clinical understudy at College of Virginia. This made for a bustling customary plan which allowed for cave investigating during the Thanksgiving break. He was getting back to unwind with family for the occasion. They arranged a day of climbing and investigating at Nutty Clay, which is viewed as a fledgling's cavern by most. The principal region of the cavern were intriguing for everybody. There was the labyrinth room, which had openings and passages driving around huge rocks. There was an enormous inclined region called the slide, where the whole room slanted down at a 45 point with a rope to direct you down. This cavern framework was very much planned in the vast majority of the traversable regions. There were additionally notable regions that were really difficult, like the birth channel or the aorta slither. These regions were tight and challenging to pass, so just more experienced cavers would endeavor to just barely get through these entries. Even with the realized difficulties, individuals actually ended up caught in difficult situations in these passages. Nutty Clay had, as of late, been freed back up to the general population in the wake of being shut for a considerable length of time as a result of cavers getting trapped in these troublesome crushes. They were tolerable for some, yet others would find that their shoulders or hips would simply not pass, regardless of how hard they pulled against the stone. In the wake of wedging themselves in the restricted space, they were totally stuck, requiring serious help to crawl out in reverse. Due to these salvages, another license-style passage was required, posting 2 experienced cavers for every gathering. Josh had gotten a license for a gathering to investigate the Tuesday prior to Thanksgiving, November 24, 2009. John's pregnant spouse, Emily, remained back at the house with their 1-year-old girl, Lizzie, to partake in a really loosening up night with the parents-in-law. Their gathering of 11 loved ones got going in the vitally open cavern segments. In the long run, John and his sibling Josh took 2 companions off to find additional provoking passages to attempt. They had heard tales about the birth trench and counseled the guide for its area. It was known to be a long, close entry with an especially difficult situation close to the end. On the off chance that you could simply move beyond the tightest part, there would be a little room toward the finish to stand up and pivot. They realize that the birth waterway would be tight and could be frenzy initiating in any event. For experienced cavers, they spread out to attempt to track down this specific passage. John and Josh took the entry on the left, traveling through a little passage for around 15 FD. It undulated all over in a few heights throughout the following 10 FD. There were offshoots of rocks and difficult situations that required a caver to bend their body in a few directions to get shoulders past, then hips, lastly winding legs so that they curve in the legitimate bearing. It was anything but a question of just getting your body strongly through a tight opening. This region was known as the wine tool on the grounds that the rare sorts of people who had experienced it were little and flexible, utilizing every one of their abilities to move gradually through the frenzy, instigating reshapings. After the wine tool region, the entry points up for another 5 FT or so, then, at that point, turns down over a stone edge with a sharp 90 twist to one side. As of not long ago, cavers had utilized this little region after the wine tool turn around on themselves if necessary and head back through the troublesome segment. 5 years before, a 16-year-old kid named Jon Clark was trapped in this wine tool area. He was just 5'7" in tall and weighed 140 lb, yet got wedged when he was attempting to pivot it. Took 14 hours for heroes to free him. Jon was in the specific place where Brock got adhered, attempting to pivot since Jon was 6 feet tall and 200 lb. He plainly realized that pivoting in this piece of the passage was impossible for him. He was in a 12-in high space with insufficient sidelong region for his squeezed body to cluster for a turn. He drove forward to the edge region and crushed off the highest point of it. Was a tight region to traverse, however he figured he could see it open up. Down beneath he sucked in his stomach and squeezed himself through the press. Pulling forward on the rocks before him, he would be moving head first in a downwards point now, yet it seemed as though there was a region ahead. To pivot, Jon didn't know it yet. No other person had at any point gotten over this edge before. He was in totally unfamiliar domain. In spite of being in a very close and awkward position, Jon maintained an even mind. He was sure that there would be an opening ahead from the start. He assumed he was in some piece of the birth trench, where numerous cavers had felt stuck in the choking burrow. Yet, turned out to be okay once they arrived at the opposite side. Once he went through a tight zone, he began to slide toward the lower part of this passage. He was almost doing a handstand, attempting to hold his body up and sort out some way to push in reverse. He actually couldn't turn. Presently, he was topsy-turvy. Gravity was pulling his 200 lb body against the blurring strength of his arms. He shouted out to his sibling Josh and told not to follow him, however, to return out. They talked about his choices and concluded that pushing ahead to attempt to pivot was the smartest thought. He was imploding onto his shoulders and head right now and expected to take action to escape this upward position. His headlamp provided him with a brief look at an opening in the floor ahead, which could prompt a bigger space. He felt somewhat more confident now, feeling that they would be snickering about this misfortune over Thanksgiving supper. He made the slight turn and headed towards the opening. Precisely the way in which he found himself mixed up with this passage opening is obscure. It's imagined that he might have slipped, hit his head, and thin, only 18 in by 10 in, not a lot greater than the screen of a PC, ended up wedged almost totally topsy-turvy. At a 70 point, he had invested some energy attempting to propel himself back upwards out of this opening. It was debilitating. His arms were stuck in a pointless position. One collapsed under his chest, and the other caught on a stone somewhere near his side. He stressed against the walls and immediately understood that all of his work wouldn't move him. Back up 5T to the shallow passage, his calves and feet were still let loose in the entry, yet his legs were currently wedged on the littlest side of the opening, just 8 in wide. He began shouting for Josh. Again his sibling realized that he was attempting to pivot, so his hollers were not out. Decent sign. Josh advanced once more into this restricted space and crossed the wine tool way. Yet not at all like his sibling. He went feet first. This time he went on toward Jon's voice. Up over the edge he at last came to a disturbing sight. He could see the finish of his sibling's leg standing out of the stone as though it had gulped down him. He crept forward until his feet could press one of Jon's legs. He attempted to hold and pull up, while Jon pushed from his end. After a few medieval endeavors, they were both inclination depleted and baffled. Josh could see that this was intense, and they would require proficient assistance to get him out. They concurred that Josh ought to go find support, and Jon ought to attempt however much as could be expected to keep even-tempered and loose. While Josh went for help, one of the other family companions went into the area to address Jon and let him in on that he was in good company. For a few hours, Jon just stayed caught topsy-turvy, zeroed in generally on the task of breathing. The fissure pressed his chest, where just shallow breaths were conceivable. Every one of his endeavors to climb had really settled him more profound into the break. As time went on, gravity kept on pulling him again. The harsh walls of the passage, fixing its hold on his depleted body. Whenever help had shown up, the main cavern hero, Susie Mata, advanced toward where Jon was stuck. It was currently 12, 30 in the first part of the day, and Jon had been topsy-turvy for 3 hours. Susie was only 5'3" in tall so. Dealing with the wine tool region was a lot simpler, for her ropes had been attached to her lower legs as a safeguard on the off chance that she stalled out too. She kept an eye on how Jon was doing and let him in on that they'd get him out. He probably had a little flood of help. Imagining that expert assistance had shown up and he would before long be liberated from this trap, Susie tied webbing lashes around his legs and afterward took care of it back to the pit, where the passage began. A few endeavors were made to pull on the ropes to use Jon back up and out of the fissure. There was simply a lot of erosion on the ropes to make any powerful delivery on Jon. He was as yet stuck without the utilization of his arms to completely help. Subsequent to endeavoring a couple of things and taking into account numerous forceful choices, the choice was made to enroll a pulley framework altogether. To assist with lifting Jon up and out, a pulley had been effectively utilized when Jon Clark was stuck 5 years before. Despite the fact that they had an arrangement of how to help, this was not a simple area to work in. Each piece of hardware, which should be gotten from the entry, which took almost an hour to arrive at the opposite side of wine tool. The passage was very close, and just more modest power devices could be completed in, and just a single individual could be in there to help at a time, and they should be little or wiry to travel through the section. Really, it was simply not a very smart arrangement. Every pulley carved out opportunity to introduce during this time. Cavers were attempting to chat with Jon, console him, and offer stories to keep him quiet and talking. He was a sincere Mormon and invested energy, imploring and singing to look for comfort. In this unbelievable circumstance, Jon had gone through the night topsy-turvy and was giving indications of the actual restrictions of the body. To endure this position, the human body was not made to be topsy-turvy for long. The whole circulatory framework is planned utilizing beats of strain from the heart to push blood ahead through the framework, while valves and sinewy vessels would hold blood and prevent it from going in reverse. This one-manner stream adjusts pressure, gravity, and valves to keep oxygen accessible to all tissues and to eliminate poisons from the body through the kidneys. Jon's body had been battling gravity for over 12 hours. The mind was not worked to endure this sort of liquid tension. Liquids were developing in his lungs and poisons were beginning to gather from the absence of appropriate flow. His organs were pushing on his lungs, and every breath was a debilitating exertion for muscles not worked for such work. His breathing was easing back, and he was totally burnt through from the energy over the course of the night. He had gone from being totally quiet and clear to powerlessly whipping his legs and daydreaming. It was horrendous to look for the heroes. They were vulnerable, depleted, and feeling caught themselves. The air in this cavern framework was warm and moist. It required a purposeful work to remain serenely breathing when you are confined and can't move or try and inhale appropriately. Yet the heroes realized they could get out when required. Jon didn't have that extravagance. He was unable to extend his chest to inhale, and the air around him was losing its oxygen focus gradually. During this time, a wired telecom framework was carried down to where Jon was stuck. His significant other talked with him, empowering him to hold tight and be devoted. Jon guaranteed her that he would be out with her soon. It was only after 4:00 that day that they at long last got the pulley set up to move him. Ryan Schertz was in the passage when the framework was prepared to attempt. Jon's body had subsided into the tight side of the opening, so Ryan needed to push his legs over as the group pulled from outside. Each hurl moved him inch by inch up in the clear. At this point, Jon's legs were in unbearable torment. A rope had been tied around his legs for quite a long time, as heroes attempted different techniques to help him out. They were totally blue and had no recognizable heartbeat at this point. Each pull had him shout to stop, as his nerves were ultra delicate right now. They stopped to give him a second to collect himself, and afterward attempted once more. It was by all accounts working. Jon was at long last being pulled up out of this opening. He was raised enough for Ryan to peer down to visually connect with him, and pass down a cylinder to drink Gatorade. This work was very sluggish going, and they were undeniably depleted from the troublesome exertion. Ryan was crushed in a passage only 12 in high, and had his head close to Jon's legs, as they worked him gradually out of the tight 10 in fissure, despite the fact that they were making some advancement in lifting him up. They were no nearer to getting him out. His legs were raising a ruckus around town roof over his passage, and turning them into the section was unimaginable. He had zero power over his legs, now following 19 hours topsy-turvy, without his assistance to curve gently his knees to the side. They were emphatically considering breaking his legs to get him back into the section, since there was simply no time to spare for Jon. Then, in an unexpected snapshot of blinding agony, Ryan shut down. When he came to, he was draining vigorously. Furthermore, confounded, the rope holding the pulley to a characteristic curve segment in the cavern broke, and whipped the carabiner and pulley straight forwardly into Ryan's face. He endured harm to his face, lip and tongue, as well as a blackout. He needed to leave rapidly. Jay was back where he begun, totally wedged in the passage, with the course to his arms cut off and his legs totally dead. He couldn't assist with liberating himself in any capacity. This second begun the last end of Jon Jones, after Ryan was looked at in the pit and afterwards shipped off to the emergency clinic. His dad Dave had his spot in the section with Jon. It required an hour to restore the pulley lines, and Dave attempted to tie a rope around Jon's body, yet couldn't get the rope past his wedged middle. So constantly Dave was with Jon, he was not responsive. This whole activity expected Jon's assistance to actually protect him. It was basically impossible to lift his 200 lb6T outline without him pushing and attempting to use himself here and there in Dave's work. To tie up Jon, he stalled himself out for around 15 minutes there. Frantic work to assist with saving this man had endangered the two, his child and himself. It was an overwhelming reality. Whenever he had propelled himself back into the 12 in burrow, he was depleted and needed to leave. Brandon Coalais had his spot and gotten the telecom framework so Jay's family could converse with him. His significant other Emily communicated her affection and advised him to enjoy some time off rest. After all of his work, she still really accepted he would be emerging, yet Brandon could see what she couldn't. Jon was, as of now, not responsive, and no indications of something going on under the surface could be heard. Over the past a few hours, Ryan detailed the sputtering breaths that Jon was battling with. Now there was quietness. The salvage group accumulated in the pit region inside the cavern and examined the circumstance. It was resolved that a clinical expert would require to affirm that he had really passed. A paramedic was sent into the tight segment to affirm what was thought at 11:56 on Wednesday, November 25. The Jon Jones was articulated dead. The salvage groups labored for 24 hours in a row to attempt to free Jon. However, it was simply not conceivable with his topsy-turvy position. The clock was ticking, and he just used up all available time. Jon endured a phenomenal 27 hours in a reverse position, which is quite a bit longer than whatever was anticipated as conceivable. The 6 salvage staff who really arrived at Jon in that rough jail were really chivalrous. They obstinately positioned themselves in a piece of the cavern that was unmapped with many known gambles. They were benevolent in their endeavors, kept a quiet disposition, and never abandoned an apparently unthinkable salvage. After they discovered that recuperating the body would be unimaginable, Jon was passed on to rest in the Ed's Push segment of the Nutty Clay Cave. Forever the whole cavern framework was shut off with concrete, at no point ever to be investigated in the future. A plaque was set there to honor the existence of Jon Jones.